The universe operates on principles we understand: physics, chemistry, the fundamental laws of cause and effect. Starfleet has catalogued thousands of anomalies, mapped the edges of known space, and stared down gods who turned out to be energy beings with superiority complexes. But what happens when something appears that defies every sensor, every theory, every rational explanation? What happens when the Federation encounters not an alien pretending to be divine, but something that might actually be? If you want to see more characters enter the Star Trek universe, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. Live long and prosper. Sector 441 was unremarkable by any standard the Federation applied to deep space. A sparse cluster of K-type stars, 3 uninhabited systems, and a navigational hazard zone near the Cardassian border that made routine survey missions mildly tedious. The Enterprise D had been assigned the region following the destabilization of a subspace relay network, administrative work, the kind that Picard endured with characteristic grace and a great deal of Earl Grey. He was in his ready room, reviewing cultural anthropology reports filed after the extraordinary discovery of the humanoid progenitor species, when the ship shuddered. Not the familiar tremor of a weapon's impact or a warp core fluctuation. Something deeper. A vibration that seemed to pass through the hull and into the bones of everyone aboard, as though the Enterprise itself had been struck by something that physics had no category for. Red alert. Lieutenant Worf's voice preceded the klaxon by half a second, which told Picard the Klingon had seen something that alarmed him before the sensors had finished processing it. Picard was on the bridge in 12 seconds. The view screen showed him Sector 441. And Sector 441 was no longer unremarkable. Where empty space had been, there was a wound. There was no better word for it. A tear approximately 4 kilometers across, its edges burning with light that shifted between gold and deep violet, that pulsed with rhythms too organic to be a natural subspace phenomenon. It looked less like a wormhole and more like something had reached through the fabric of space from the other side and simply pulled. Report, Picard said, settling into his chair with deliberate calm. Sensors are. Data paused, which was itself remarkable. The android did not pause. Struggling to characterize the phenomenon, Captain. The energy readings are consistent with a subspace rupture, but the underlying frequency signatures do not match any catalogued anomaly. There are elements that superficially resemble a Bajorian wormhole in terms of dimensional topology, but the energy source appears to be. Another pause, shorter. Biological in origin. Or something that our instruments are interpreting as biological because they have no alternative framework. What came through? Picard asked. Counselor Troy answered before the sensors could. She had gone pale, her dark eyes wide, both hands gripping her armrests. 2 presences, she said. One is enormous. Ancient. There's grief in it, and anger, and something that feels like the weight of 10,000 years of decisions. And the other? She shook her head. The other is pure destruction. Hunger without thought. On the view screen, 2 shapes had emerged from the rupture. The first was a column of fire approximately 30 meters tall, vaguely humanoid, moving through the vacuum of space with contemptuous ease, leaving trails of plasma in its wake that were already registering on the tactical display as hazardous to hull integrity. The second was a man. Or the shape of one. He stood in open space, no suit, no environmental field, no technological mediation of any kind, on what appeared to be empty air, as though gravity were a matter of personal preference. He was old in the way that mountains are old, in the way that the suggestion of age becomes indistinguishable from power. A gray cloak snapped around him in a solar wind that shouldn't have been able to touch fabric. A broad-brimmed hat cast one side of his face in shadow. One eye caught the light of the rupture behind him, the other was a closed seam of scar tissue. In his right hand, a spear that seemed to hum with the same impossible energy as the tear in space itself. He turned, and looked directly at the Enterprise. Not at the view screen. Not at the ship in a general navigational sense. At the bridge. At them. He can see us, Troy whispered. He knows exactly where we are. Worf had gone very still in the particular way that Klingon do when every instinct is screaming threat assessment. Shields are at full, Captain. Phasers are armed. The fire entity has destroyed a navigational buoy. Debris field consistent with a directed thermal event in excess of 30 million Kelvin. Picard stood. He clasped his hands behind his back and studied the figure on the view screen for a long moment. A man standing in the void of space, breathing vacuum, watching a starship with the patient attention of someone who had been watching ships for longer than the Federation had existed. "Mr. Data," he said quietly. "Open a channel." "Channel open, Captain." Jean-Luc Picard spoke to the vacuum of space the way he had spoken to Q, to the Borg, to empires and collectives and things that had worn the word God like a borrowed coat. "I am Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the Federation Starship Enterprise. You are in Federation space. We mean you no harm, and we ask that you identify yourself and state your intentions." The response came not through the comm system. It came through the hull. Through the air. Through the frequency of every speaker and panel on the bridge simultaneously, in a voice that sounded like the first word ever spoken by a species that had learned language before humans had learned fire. "I know what you are, little ship. I have watched your kind for longer than your civilization remembers being watched. Stand aside. I have business with that creature, and I will not have it complicated by those who would call themselves my equals." The bridge was silent. Worf broke it. "He is either extraordinarily powerful, Captain, or extraordinarily arrogant." Picard sat back down, very slowly, and picked up his Earl Grey from the armrest console where he had somehow carried it from the ready room without noticing. "In my experience, Mr. Worf," he said, "those two qualities are rarely mutually exclusive." The fire entity had moved. While every eye on the bridge had been fixed on the figure standing in open space, the column of flame had drifted 300 kilometers spinward, and was now positioned between the Enterprise and the nearest uninhabited system, a dry, rocky world with a thin nitrogen atmosphere that the survey manifest listed as Sector 441C. It wasn't threatening the planet with any obvious intent, but the thermal readings climbing on Data's console suggested that proximity alone was doing damage to the upper atmosphere. "It's heating the ionosphere," LaForge reported from engineering via comm, his voice carrying the particular tension of someone watching numbers move in directions they shouldn't. "If it sustains that output for another 40 minutes, we're looking at atmospheric ignition. That planet is uninhabited, but Captain, the subspace relay station on the fourth moon is not. 12 Starfleet technicians." Picard filed that away in the place where urgency lived and was managed rather than obeyed. "Mr. Worf, what is the status of our guest?" "Still stationary, sir. Approximately 800 meters off the port bow. He has not moved since hailing us." Worf looked up from his console with the expression he reserved for things he respected against his better judgment. "He is standing in hard vacuum, Captain. Ambient temperature negative 270 degrees. No life signs registering on conventional biosensors. And yet," he checked again, as though hoping the reading had changed, "he is quite clearly alive. What do biosensors show?" Data turned from his console. "That is precisely the difficulty, Captain. The biosensors return readings, but the readings describe something that our medical database cannot classify. There is a cardiovascular system of some kind, but it operates at intervals inconsistent with any known biology. There is neurological activity, but it encompasses frequencies we typically associate with subspace field generation rather than organic cognition." He tilted his head at the view screen. "Whatever he is not pretending to be alive. He is alive in a manner our instruments were not designed to measure." "Counselor." Troy had recovered her composure, though her hands remained on her armrests. "The grief I sensed is still there. Underneath everything else. The authority, the age, the power, there is something that has lost something dear to it. Recently, I think. Or what passes for recently at that scale of existence." She met Picard's eyes. "He's not here by accident, Captain. He came through that rupture in pursuit. Whatever that fire creature is, it means something to him. Something personal. Picard made his decision the way he always did, by standing up. I'm going to speak with him. In person. The bridge reacted with the particular silence of a crew too professional to say "Are you out of your mind, Captain?" simultaneously. Worf managed it first. "Captain, transporting to within 800 meters of an unclassified entity of unknown." "I'm not transporting, Mr. Worf. I'm going to the shuttle bay." Picard smoothed his uniform. "If he's standing in open space without equipment, I suspect the gesture of meeting him in a shuttle. Making myself comparatively vulnerable, demonstrating trust, will communicate more than anything I could say through a calm channel." He paused. "Besides, he's already demonstrated he can reach us if he chooses to. Force fields and hull plating are not what's keeping us safe right now. Courtesy is." He left the bridge before anyone could assemble a sufficiently regulation-compliant objection. The shuttle banting cleared the shuttle bay doors and Picard eased it to within 50 meters of the figure before cutting propulsion and simply drifting. Through the forward viewport, the being was extraordinary even by the standards of someone who had met the queue. Up close, the sense of age was almost architectural. It wasn't in the lines of his face, which were severe but not decrepit, it was in the stillness. The way he held himself suggested someone who had stood in worse places than the vacuum of space and found them merely inconvenient. The spear in his hand caught starlight and returned something richer, gold threaded through silver, humming at a frequency Picard could feel in his back molars through the shuttle hull. The single eye found the viewport. Found Picard specifically. And then, with what Picard could only interpret as deliberate condescension converted at the last moment into deliberate respect, a meaningful distinction, the figure floated forward and stopped just beyond the viewport glass. Close enough to see the texture of the gray cloak. Close enough to see that the closed eye socket was not simply scarred but intentionally sealed, the way a wound is sealed when the wound itself is a choice. He spoke, and this time the voice came through the shuttle comm at a normal volume, as though he had learned in the intervening minutes how the technology worked. "You came out in a small vessel. Alone. Without weapons drawn." The voice was quieter now. Still immense, but calibrated. "Either you are very brave or very foolish. In my experience," Picard said, "those two qualities are also rarely mutually exclusive." He let the echo of Worf's words hang for a moment, a small human joke offered without explanation, before continuing. "My name is Jean-Luc Picard. I command the vessel behind me. I would like to know who you are, why you're here, and whether we can help you with whatever business you have with that creature." The single eye studied him. "You speak to me as though I were an ambassador." "I speak to everyone as though they were an ambassador," Picard said. "It tends to produce better outcomes than the alternative." Something shifted in the ancient face, not quite amusement, but the shadow of recognition. The look of someone who has met, across 10,000 years and 9 worlds, very few people worth the bother of honesty, and is surprised to find themselves potentially in the presence of one more. "I am Odin," he said. "All-Father of Asgard. King of the 9 realms. And that creature you are so concerned about burning your small moon, that is the Herald of Surtur, who I have chased across 3-dimensional barriers and will not allow to ignite a 10th world." The eye narrowed. "Stand aside, Captain. This is not your war." Picard held his gaze across 50 meters of vacuum and the entire philosophical distance between a Starfleet captain and a king of gods. "With respect," he said carefully, "those 12 people on that moon make it mine." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of a scale being balanced, Odin on one side, Picard's 12 technicians on the other, and 10,000 years of divine prerogative weighing down the former with a gravity that had nothing to do with physics. Picard held the eye contact and did not look away, which he suspected was itself a kind of answer to a question Odin had been asking since the shuttle cleared the bay doors. "Your people are not in danger from me," Odin said finally. "The Herald cares nothing for 12 mortals on a rock. It seeks worlds of consequence. Populations. Fuel. The word landed with the weight of genuine knowledge rather than metaphor. Surtur's fire does not burn for warmth. It burns to grow. Then help me protect them, Picard said. Not as a king issuing terms. As someone who knows this enemy, and is willing to share that knowledge with people who have the resources and the will to act on it. Another long assessment. Then, you are persistent for a creature of such short duration. 80 years, give or take. Picard agreed. We tend to make the most of it. He brought the shuttle around in Odin, without being asked, without acknowledging that following was something he was doing rather than choosing. Fell into position alongside it, moving through vacuum with the casual ease of a man crossing a familiar room. When the shuttle bay doors opened and the atmospheric field shimmered, Odin passed through it without breaking stride, his boots connecting with the deck with a solidity that sent a tremor through the shuttle bay floor that the ship's internal sensors registered as a minor seismic event. Worf met them at the bay doors with 6 security officers and the expression of a man profoundly committed to his duty, and equally aware of its limitations. Odin looked at the phasers. He looked at Worf. Something that was not quite a smile moved across his face. A warrior, he said. Good. At least one of you has sense. Worf's jaw tightened. You will submit to a bios cannon. I will not. Pleasantly, utterly finally. Picard stepped between them. Mr. Worf, stand down. Our guest will accompany us to the observation lounge. He glanced at Odin. If that's acceptable. I have sat in worse halls, Odin said, which Picard chose to interpret as yes. The observation lounge filled with the senior staff in under 4 minutes, which was a record motivated entirely by the fact that there was an entity sitting at the conference table who had arrived in their universe by tearing a hole in space and could apparently breathe vacuum as a lifestyle choice. Beverly Crusher had brought a medical tricorder and was attempting scans with the focused determination of someone who had long since made peace with the universe being stranger than anticipated. Data had a PhD and was writing faster than he normally needed to, which meant the data was not fitting into existing categories and he was creating new ones in real time. Troy sat across from Odin and did not attempt to hide the fact that she was sensing him. She had the distinct impression he knew, and didn't mind, and was perhaps sensing her back in ways she couldn't detect. Your readings are, Crusher began. Unprecedented, Data supplied. Extraordinary. Resistant to classification. He set down the PhD with something approaching reluctance. Your biology, such as our instruments can characterize it, is not biological in any conventional sense. You are composed of matter, but the matter is arranged in patterns that correspond to energy states we associate with subspace field dynamics rather than organic chemistry. Your neurological activity registers on frequencies our sensors typically use to detect warp field generation. He paused. In essence, you do not read as alive. You read as a fundamental force that has chosen to take a shape. Odin considered this. Your machines are more perceptive than I expected. He is more than he appears, Data said, which for an android constituted high praise. The Odin force, Odin said, as though naming something that should require no further explanation. When the table met this with polite scientific blankness, he elaborated with the patience of someone who has explained fire to people who have never seen winter. The power that flows through Asgard. Through the 9 realms. The fundamental energy of creation and destruction that underlies all things in my universe, as your. He glanced at La Forge, who had arrived directly from engineering with grease on his visor and coffee in his hand. Warp fields underlie yours. He set Gungnir against the table with a resonant thrum that rattled the viewports. Here, it is diminished. I feel it as a man feels a limb gone cold. The function remains. The sensitivity does not. La Forge leaned forward, engineering instincts overriding personal caution. The subspace layer, he said. The fabric that warp drive manipulates, it's permeating everything in this universe at the quantum level. If your power source operates on a different set of fundamental constants, different dark energy structures, different dimensional topology, then our subspace would act like interference. Like static on a calm channel. Odin turned the single eye on him with an attention that made LaForge sit back slightly. You understand this quickly. I've worked with a lot of weird energy, Geordi said honestly. Your abilities, Crusher interjected, tricorder's still active. At what capacity are you currently operating? A pause. The first real pause. Not the theatrical silence of a king managing his court, but the pause of someone doing an honest internal accounting and not entirely pleased with the result. Perhaps 8 parts in 10, Odin said. Strength, the spear, endurance, these are unchanged. The deeper workings. His hand moved in a gesture that might have indicated reality bending, or fate weaving, or something for which no human language had developed a gesture. These are slower. Costlier. Like speaking a language through water. Troy spoke carefully. You said the Herald seeks worlds of consequence. Populations. Fuel. She held his gaze. How many worlds has it already taken? The weight returned to his face. Ancient and specific and grieving. 3, he said. In my realms before it crossed the barrier. Worlds I was sworn to protect. The single eye moved to the view screen, where 441C still glowed faintly against the dark. I will not add a 4th. Regardless of what universe I must bleed in to prevent it. The observation lounge was very quiet. Picard broke it the way he always did, with a question that treated the answer as already being a collaboration. Then tell us what it is, he said. Tell us everything. And we'll figure out together what can be done. Odin spoke for 40 minutes without interruption, which was itself a minor historical event. Picard could count on one hand the senior staff meetings that had proceeded without Data offering a taxonomic correction or Worf registering a tactical objection. But there was something in the Allfather's cadence that foreclosed interruption the way a cathedral forecloses small talk. Not through intimidation precisely, but through the quality of the silence he generated around himself. The silence of someone for whom words were not communication but architecture, each one placed with the deliberate weight of long experience. The Herald of Surtur, he explained, was not a creature in any biological sense. It was a projection. An advanced instrument of Surtur's will, composed of Muspelheim fire, the primordial flame that had existed before the 9 realms took shape, the fire that Surtur believed would one day consume all things in the final conflagration called Ragnarok. The Herald did not think. It did not negotiate. It consumed worlds to generate the thermal energy required to maintain its dimensional coherence, a perpetual hunger that expanded proportionally with the fuel it found. It crossed the dimensional barrier, Odin said, because I wounded Surtur. Drove him back. What you see is not an attack. It is a refugee. A fragment of his power, cast loose, seeking fuel to reconstitute itself into something capable of tearing the barrier open again from this side and allowing Surtur to follow. The implication settled over the observation lounge like a drop in atmospheric pressure. It's trying to build a door, LaForge said. From the inside. Data added. Using inhabited worlds as fuel. Crusher finished, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone converting horror into clinical language to keep functioning. Odin inclined his head. 3 realms. 3 worlds sufficient in thermal mass and population density to generate the necessary energy. It needs one more. He gestured at the view screen without looking at it, the gesture of a man pointing at something he has already looked at too long. Your 441C is insufficient, too small, too sparse. It is circling. Searching. Within your system of... He paused, reaching for terminology. Light years, there are more populated worlds. Nearest inhabited system from here is the Dorvan sector, Worf said immediately, tactical mind already running the geometry. Federation colony. Approximately 60,000 civilians. Then we have a timetable, Picard said. We have less than that, Odin replied. The Herald is not merely searching. It is also calling. Every moment it sustains itself in this universe, it broadcasts a signal across dimensional frequencies. Surtur will feel it. He will attempt to force another crossing. The single eye moved around the table, measuring each face with the attention of someone who has learned to assess allies quickly because the alternative is assessing them too late. I came through the rupture because I was close enough to follow immediately. The passage cost me. Surtur's direct crossing would cost him more, but he has more to spend. How long? Picard asked. Days. Perhaps less. Picard stood, and the room oriented around him the way it always did. Not through rank alone but through the particular quality of his attention when a decision had crystallized. Mr. Data, I want the full sensor sweep of the surrounding 12 light years. Every thermal anomaly, every inhabited world, every installation. I want to know where the Herald is most likely to move before it moves. He turned to LaForge. Geordi, I want options for containing or disrupting a 30-meter plasma entity. Work with whatever parameters our guest can provide about Muspelheim fire. He looked at Worf. Yellow alert. I want us between the Herald and the Dwarven sector within the hour. He turned last to Odin, and the deliberateness of leaving him for last was itself a message, not subordination but partnership. We need to discuss what role you're willing to play in this, and what you're capable of given your current limitations. The word landed carefully. Odin's eye narrowed fractionally, the reflex of a king unaccustomed to the word limitations applied to himself, and then, slowly, with the dignity of genuine wisdom rather than pride, he nodded. Ask your questions, Captain? They never got to the questions. The ship lurched with a violence that sent LaForge's coffee across the table, and brought the red alert klaxon to life before Worf had cleared his chair. On the view screen, 441C was no longer glowing faintly. It was burning. Not the gradual atmospheric ignition LaForge had predicted. Something faster. The Herald had stopped circling and descended, and the planet's thin nitrogen atmosphere had become an accelerant. From orbit, the world looked like a coal catching, dark at the edges, incandescent at the center, growing. The relay station, Picard said. Attempting to contact. The officer at Ops shook her head. No response, Captain. Subspace interference from the thermal event is, the entire comm spectrum in that sector is saturated. 12 people. Picard was moving before the thought finished. Transporter range? Negative. Thermal convection from the surface event is generating electromagnetic interference that would scatter the pattern buffer before. Shuttles. Captain, Worf said sharply. Hull temperature on approach would reach critical within. Odin stood. He stood the way a storm stands up, not from a chair but from stillness into presence, the full weight of him suddenly occupying the room in a way it hadn't before, Gungnir in his hand, the Odin force humming at the edges of his form with a gold light that made the observation lounge's panels flicker. Which moon? He said. The fourth, Picard said immediately. No hesitation, no qualification. An answer given to someone capable of acting on it. Odin looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then he turned and walked through the observation lounge wall. Not through a door. Not through a panel that happened to open. Through the wall, the hull, the structural integrity field, and the vacuum beyond, as though matter were a suggestion he had considered and declined. On the internal sensors, his signal moved at a velocity that made Data's console emit a small alarm tone, not warp speed, not impulse, something without a Starfleet category, toward the burning moon. The bridge was silent except for the klaxon and the sound of a planet dying 300 kilometers away. Data, Picard said quietly. Is he? He is there, Captain. Data looked up from his console, and if an android could sound shaken he managed the adjacent quality. He is on the fourth moon. And he is, pulling them out. One by one. The life signs, all 12, are relocating. Rapidly. A pause. He is carrying them. Through the fire. Picard stood at the view screen and watched a god walk through a burning world to collect 12 people that were not his responsibility, in a universe that was not his home, because a man in a small shuttle had said the word mine and meant it. He filed that away too. In a different place than urgency. Somewhere quieter. The 12 technicians from Relay Station 441 Delta arrived on the Enterprise transporter pad in a condition that the medical team would spend 3 hours documenting and a great deal longer trying to explain. They were alive, completely, inexplicably, without significant injury alive, despite having been on a moon whose surface temperature had reached 4,000 Kelvin by the time Odin reached them. 2 had minor burns. 1 had a fractured wrist from debris impact during the initial thermal event. Their uniforms were scorched at the edges, their faces were streaked with ash, and every single one of them had the expression of people whose understanding of the universe had just been fundamentally restructured. Ensign Terrella, the station's junior communications officer, sat on the edge of the transporter pad while Crusher ran a tricorder over her and said, with the distant calm of someone still processing, "He just walked in. Through the wall. The fire was everywhere and he walked through it like it wasn't there, and he looked at us and said..." She stopped. "What did he say?" Crusher asked. "He said the captain has need of you. And then he gathered us and the fire just moved around him. Like it was afraid of him." Crusher filed the report and sent it to Picard with a note that read, "I have no medical explanation." Which from Beverly Crusher was the equivalent of anyone else writing, "I have seen something that has fundamentally altered my conception of the possible." Odin returned to the Enterprise the same way he had left, through the hull, through the structural integrity field, through the reasonable expectation that matter was a barrier rather than a preference. He appeared on the bridge, because he had apparently determined that was where Picard would be, trailing faint traces of Muspelheim fire that dissipated against the ship's atmosphere like smoke and wind. His cloak was untouched. His expression was closed in the particular way of someone who has done a thing they consider unremarkable, and wishes to proceed. Picard looked at him for a moment. Then, "Thank you?" Odin said nothing. He moved to stand at the view screen, watching the ruin of 441C with the expression of a man adding it to a very long internal list. "The Herald fed," he said. "Not fully. Your moon was insufficient fuel for what it needs. But it is stronger than it was an hour ago. It will move faster now." "We're already repositioning," Picard said. "Dorvan sector, maximum warp. We'll be there in 6 hours." "And your superiors?" Odin asked, the word superiors carrying a subtle weight, not mocking, precisely, but the note of a man for whom the concept of having superiors was primarily theoretical. Picard had been expecting this conversation. He had been dreading it in the specific way he dreaded conversations where he was required to defend decisions that were defensible but not comfortable. "Starfleet Command has been notified. They're assessing the situation." "Assessing," Odin repeated. "We have a chain of command," Picard said. "Protocols. A structure that exists for good reasons, even when those reasons produce friction in situations that weren't anticipated by the people who built the structure." The single eye moved from the view screen to Picard. "You are a man who believes in his civilization's rules." "I am a man who believes in his civilization," Picard said carefully. "The rules are the attempt to codify those beliefs. They are not always the same thing." Odin studied him with the attention of someone revising an estimate upward. The communication from Starfleet Command came 4 hours into their transit to the Dorvan sector, routed through Admiral Nechayev's office with the particular formatting that indicated the Admiral herself had composed it rather than delegating to staff. Picard took it in his ready room. Nechayev's face on the screen was composed in the manner of someone who had received a briefing that had caused her to send everyone else out of the room before she had finished reading it. "Captain Picard," she said, "I've reviewed your preliminary report on the entity currently aboard your vessel. Starfleet Command's position is as follows, the being identified as..." She glanced down. "Odin is to be considered an anomalous contact under General Order 15 until his nature and intentions can be fully assessed. You are authorized to maintain communication with him, but not to make any agreements, commitments, or operational arrangements on behalf of the Federation. He is not to have access to classified systems, navigational databases, or... Admiral. Picard kept his voice even. With respect, this entity single-handedly evacuated 12 Starfleet personnel from a burning moon approximately 2 hours ago. He did so without being asked, at personal cost to himself, without any condition or negotiation. Which is exactly the kind of behavior that concerns us, Nechayev said. An entity capable of that level of intervention, operating without any framework of accountability. He has his own framework of accountability, Picard said. It's simply older than ours. The silence on the other end was the silence of an admiral choosing her next words with precision. Captain? I'm sending a security attachment to rendezvous with you at Dorvan. The Venture and the Cairo are diverting to your position. In the meantime, you are ordered to confine the entity to... The ready room door opened. Odin walked in without knocking, in the manner of someone for whom doors were a courtesy he extended rather than a barrier he respected. He looked at the screen. Nechayev looked at him. The expression on her face moved through several stages in rapid succession. Admiral, Odin said pleasantly, the way a glacier is pleasant. I have walked in the halls of kings for 10,000 years and I have never required confinement to demonstrate my intentions. I will say this once clearly, so that your chain of command may convey it efficiently upward to whoever requires convincing. I am here to destroy the Herald before it destroys one of your worlds. I require your captain's cooperation, not your permission. You may assist or you may observe. Both are acceptable. Obstruction is not. He turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind him. Picard looked at the screen. Nechayev looked at Picard. I'll keep you informed, Admiral, he said. Her expression suggested she was composing at least 4 responses simultaneously and had rejected all of them. See that you do, Captain, she said finally, and closed the channel. Picard sat alone in his ready room for a moment. Outside the viewport, the stars were streaking past at warp 9. He thought about civilizations and the rules they built. About kings and chains of command. About a man who had walked through fire for 12 strangers and then walked into an admiral's briefing without an appointment. He thought about what Troy had said. Grief. Loss. 10,000 years of decisions. Then he picked up his tea and went back to his bridge. The Romulan warbird decloaked at 0347 hours, ship's time, which Picard had long ago identified as the hour the Romulans preferred for dramatic entrances, late enough that human crews were statistically likely to be operating on reduced alertness, early enough that it couldn't be characterized as a morning confrontation. The RW Valdor dropped out of cloak directly off the Enterprise's port bow at a distance that was technically outside weapons range and practically inside personal space, its predatory silhouette catching the light of the Dorvan system's distant sun like a blade being deliberately displayed rather than drawn. Worf was at tactical before the cloak's signature had fully dissipated. Romulan warbird, Daradex class. Weapons powered but not locked. They're hailing us, Captain. Of course they are, Picard said. On screen. Commander Torek of the Valdor was precisely the kind of Romulan that Picard found most demanding to deal with, not the overtly aggressive kind, whose intentions at least had the virtue of clarity, but the thoughtful kind. The kind with patient eyes and a slight smile that suggested the conversation had already occurred in his mind, and he was merely performing it now for the record. He was perhaps 60 by Romulan reckoning, with the broad forehead ridges of old Romulan bloodlines and the careful stillness of someone trained by the Tal Shiar to reveal nothing that wasn't calculated to be revealed. Captain Picard, he said warmly. What a remarkable coincidence. The Valdor was conducting routine patrol operations in this sector when our sensors detected what appears to be an unprecedented dimensional anomaly near the Cardassian border. Naturally, we felt obliged to investigate. Naturally, Picard said. Our sensors also detected, I must confess, energy readings of a most extraordinary character emanating from your vessel. The slight smile. Readings inconsistent with any known Federation technology or biological profile. I wonder if you might satisfy my curiosity. I wonder if you might explain what a Deridex-class warbird considers routine patrol in Federation space 12 light-years from the neutral zone. Torik's smile broadened by precisely 2 millimeters, the Romulan equivalent of a laugh. A fair point, Captain. Perhaps we might speak more frankly. The Tal Shiar has been monitoring subspace for dimensional anomalies for some time. The rupture in Sector 441 registered on sensors across 3 sectors. Whatever came through that rupture, the Empire has an interest in understanding it. For defensive purposes, Picard said. Naturally. He kept Torik engaged for 20 minutes, long enough for Data to confirm that the Valdor had not, in fact, arrived alone. A second vessel, a Romulan scout ship running minimal power to reduce its sensor profile, was holding position behind Dorvan Ivy's largest moon. Picard noted this, said nothing about it, and continued the conversation with the tranquil focus of a chess player who has spotted his opponent's gambit and is deciding whether to address it or exploit it. What ended the conversation was not Picard's choice. Odin appeared on the bridge. He had spent the transit hours in the cargo bay that Picard had offered him, not confinement. Picard had been careful about the language, but space, privacy, somewhere to sit that wasn't a corridor. He had accepted it with the dignity of a man who understood the difference between being managed and being respected and had decided, for now, that Picard's approach qualified as the latter. But something had drawn him out, and that something was apparently visible on the view screen. He looked at Torik. Torik looked at him. The Romulan commander's composure was exceptional. The slight widening of his eyes lasted perhaps half a second before professional discipline reasserted itself. But Odin, who had spent 10,000 years reading the faces of beings across 9 worlds, caught it with the ease of someone for whom other people's reactions were data he had always collected. Romulans, he said, with the tone of a man consulting an internal catalog. Offshoots of the Vulcan people. Chose passion over logic. Built an empire on secrecy and strategic patience. He studied Torik. I have known peoples like yours. They are rarely what they present themselves as, and occasionally more than they believe themselves to be. Torik recovered magnificently. A remarkable assessment from someone I have only just met. I am very old, Odin said simply. And I have one eye, which teaches you to look carefully with the one you have. He moved to stand beside Picard, and the gesture, deliberate, visible on Torik's view screen, was the clearest possible statement of alignment without being a formal declaration of anything. Your captain is handling something beyond your empire's current ability to manage. I would suggest observation over interference. Torik's eyes moved between Odin and Picard with the rapid calculation of someone repricing every assumption in his operational model. Then he smiled, different this time, less performed, more genuine. Perhaps we might meet in person, he said. I find this conversation has become considerably more interesting. They met in Transporter Room 2, which Worf supervised with the intensity of a man personally offended by the universe's insistence on presenting him with situations outside his threat assessment parameters. Torik arrived with 2 aides and the practiced ease of a Romulan who had conducted sensitive meetings in more dangerous venues than a Federation starship. He was shorter than he appeared on screen, which Picard had learned was frequently true of people who commanded large things. He made his pitch in the observation lounge, with Picard and Odin across the table, and he made it well. The Romulan Star Empire, he explained, had considerable intelligence resources, a detailed knowledge of local space that complemented Starfleet's sensor reach, and, here the careful eyes moved to Odin, a profound interest in understanding the dimensional barrier and the entities that had crossed it. Not for military purposes, he was careful to say. For the security of the Empire and its people. And the 9 realms, he added. If such a relationship were of interest. Odin listened to all of it with the patience of a man who has heard every kind of offer from every kind of ruler across 10,000 years. He said nothing until Torik had finished, and the silence after was comfortable in the way that silences are comfortable when the person generating them has chosen it rather than stumbled into it. "You want access," Odin said, "to the knowledge I carry. The cosmological architecture of the 9 realms. The nature of the dimensional barriers and what lies beyond them. The Empire values knowledge," Torek said carefully. "As do I." Odin leaned forward slightly, and the single eye held something that Picard had not seen there before, a gleam that was partly amusement and partly the expression of a very old, very cunning mind that had just found a use for something it had considered peripheral. "Let me tell you what I value in return." Picard watched this with the attentive stillness of someone who had recognized, approximately 30 seconds ago, that Odin was not accepting Torek's offer. He was using it. Mining it for something the Romulans had that Odin needed, while giving them precisely enough to sustain their interest, and not one syllable more. 10,000 years of court politics, Picard thought, looks exactly like this. He decided to let it run. And to watch, very carefully, what Odin was actually after. What Odin was after, it turned out, was the Valdor's long-range sensor array. Picard understood this approximately 4 minutes into the negotiation, when Odin steered the conversation, with the unhurried precision of a river finding the lowest ground, toward the question of the dimensional rupture's current status. Whether it was stable. Whether it was expanding. Whether, specifically, it was generating secondary resonance signatures that might indicate additional crossings being prepared on the other side. The Enterprise's sensors were exceptional. The Valdor's long-range array, built on Romulan sensor architecture that approached problems from fundamentally different mathematical principles than Federation technology, could detect subspace variance patterns at ranges and frequencies that Starfleet's equipment missed. Not because Romulan technology was superior, precisely, but because it was different, designed by minds that had evolved different assumptions about what was worth looking for. Odin didn't know the technical details. But he knew, with the instinct of someone who had spent millennia reading the architecture of power, that the Romulans had brought something to this meeting that Starfleet didn't have, and that they would trade access to it for the appearance of reciprocity with an entity from beyond dimensional boundaries. He was right. Torek agreed to a shared sensor sweep within 40 minutes, framing it as cooperative security. LaForge, patched into the negotiation via Picard's barely concealed tap on the observation lounge comm system, spent those 40 minutes preparing the Enterprise's systems to integrate the Romulan feed, and trying very hard not to audibly express his excitement about interfacing with Romulan sensor architecture, which was the engineering equivalent of being handed an instrument you'd only ever read about. The results came back in under an hour, and were unambiguous in the way that bad news tends to be. The rupture was not stabilizing. It was breathing, expanding and contracting in a rhythm that data identified, after 17 minutes of analysis, as harmonic with the Herald's energy output. Every time the Herald consumed fuel, the rupture pulsed. Every pulse was marginally larger than the last. "It's a feedback loop," LaForge said, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone who has confirmed their worst hypothesis. "The Herald feeds, generates thermal energy broadcasted across dimensional frequencies, and that broadcast is literally widening the rupture. It's not just calling for surrender. It's building the door. How long before the rupture is large enough for a full dimensional crossing?" Picard asked. Data calculated. "At current expansion rate, approximately 19 hours. However," he paused with the particular quality that meant the however was the important part. "The rate is not linear. It is accelerating. If the Herald feeds again within the next 6 hours, the revised estimate drops to 11. And Dorvan," Picard said, "has a population of 62,000. Worf said, "an insufficient defensive infrastructure to resist an entity of this nature." Odin, who had been standing at the viewport since the results came in, spoke without turning. Surtur coming through would not be the Herald's consequence. It would be its purpose fulfilled. He turned then, and his face had settled into the expression Picard was beginning to recognize as Odin's version of a war footing, not anger, not urgency, but the absolute cold clarity of a commander who has stripped every extraneous consideration away and is looking at the problem with nothing between himself and it. We cannot wait for it to feed again. We move now. Agreed, Picard said. The question is how. The tactical discussion that followed was one of the stranger command conferences in Picard's career, which was a considerable standard to clear. Torek participated via a secure channel from the Valdor, contributing Romulan strategic analysis with the focused energy of a man who had recalibrated his entire mission in response to new information and was genuinely engaged rather than merely present. Worf contributed tactical options with the directness of someone who considered extended discussion a form of delay. Data contributed everything else. Odin listened to all of it and then dismantled each approach in sequence, not dismissively but surgically, identifying the specific point at which each plan's assumptions would fail against an entity composed of primordial Muspelheim fire with no biology to target, no technology to disrupt, and no psychology to manipulate. Phasers, he said, will disperse the outer plasma layer temporarily. The core is not plasma. It is Muspelheim fire, the original fire, before your universe existed. It does not respond to energy weapons as energy responds to energy. It responds as a concept responds to being argued with. Meaning it reconstitutes. Data said. Meaning it learns. Odin corrected. Every weapon you fire at it teaches it the frequency of that weapon. Within 3 exposures, it will be generating a counter-resonance that renders the weapon functionally useless. Worf leaned forward. Photon torpedoes? Same principle. Faster learning curve. You would have 2 shots before it adapted. Then what? Torek asked from the screen. Do you propose? Odin was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was with the specific quality of someone sharing information they would have preferred to keep. The Herald is not self-sustaining in this universe, he said. It feeds because it must, because Muspelheim fire is not native to your dimensional physics and must constantly consume to maintain coherence. This is why it seeks large fuel sources. Small consumptions are insufficient. It requires a single catastrophic feeding event to generate enough energy to fully stabilize and widen the rupture. So we prevent the catastrophic feeding, LaForge said. Keep it hungry. More than hungry. Starving. Odin's eye moved across the faces at the table. If the Herald cannot find sufficient fuel within a specific window, its dimensional coherence begins to fail. It will not die. It cannot die here. It is not alive here in the way that dying applies, but it will destabilize. Collapse back toward the rupture. Return through the barrier because remaining here becomes thermodynamically impossible. How long a window? Picard asked. 8 hours of sustained deprivation. Possibly less. The Romulan sensor data suggests its coherence is already under strain from the transit. He looked at Picard directly. If we can keep it away from Dorvan, keep it burning energy without finding fuel, for 8 hours it retreats. The rupture, deprived of the feedback from its feeding, destabilizes from the other side. And closes. Data said. Closes. Odin confirmed. That still leaves Surtur on the other side. Picard said. Surtur on the other side of a closed barrier. Odin said. Is Surtur contained? Which is a problem I can manage in my own universe, in my own time. Something moved across his face, not satisfaction, not quite. The expression of someone accepting a limitation they have made peace with. I cannot destroy him here. My power in this universe is insufficient for that. But I can drive his herald back. And a door that closes from both sides stays closed. Then we need a plan for 8 hours, Picard said. He looked around the table. At Worf, already running tactical scenarios in his head. At Data, whose PDD was filling with calculations. At Torek on the screen, whose expression had moved from strategic assessment to something approaching genuine investment in the outcome. At LaForge, who was already sketching modifications to the Enterprise's deflector array on a secondary PDD. And at Odin, who was watching all of them with the expression of a man who had commanded armies and councils across 10,000 years and was recalibrating, in real time, what the word command could mean when it was built on something other than authority. 8 hours, Picard said again. Let's get to work. The plan, as plans tend to do under the pressure of 11-hour timelines and primordial fire demons, evolved considerably from its original architecture. LaForge's deflector modification was the foundation, a cycling frequency pulse that would interact with the Herald's outer plasma layer not as a weapon but as an irritant, constantly shifting to prevent adaptation, designed not to damage but to herd. Like keeping a fire burning in a direction rather than extinguishing it. The principle was sound. The execution required reconfiguring the main deflector dish in ways that its designers had not anticipated, which LaForge described to his engineering team with the compressed enthusiasm of a man who has found a genuinely interesting problem inside a catastrophe. Torek contributed the Valdor's forward plasma conduits. Romulan drive technology operated on similar thermal principles to Muspelheim fire in ways that were, as Data noted, probably cosmologically significant and definitely useful right now. The Warbird could generate containment fields that the Herald would find repellent not because they were stronger but because they were thermodynamically incompatible. The Romulan artificial singularity at the Warbird's core produced a gravitational gradient that Muspelheim fire, for reasons Odin described and Data translated into physics, found deeply uncomfortable. It is like, Odin said, searching for the right framework, a creature of great heat encountering a cold so fundamental that it predates heat itself. The singularity is older than Muspelheim fire in the way that darkness is older than light. Artificial quantum singularities, Data said, do in fact predate stellar ignition in the universe's chronological development. The mathematics are consistent. Torek, listening to this exchange, had the expression of a Romulan commander who was simultaneously proud of his ship's capability and mildly unsettled by the cosmological implications of its power source. The third element was Odin himself. He would be the active component, not the weapon, not the wall, but the shepherd. The Odin force, even at diminished capacity, resonated with Muspelheim fire in a way that Federation and Romulan technology could not replicate. Where the Enterprise could irritate and the Valdor could repel, Odin could direct. He understood the Herald's nature not as a sensor reading but as a lived familiarity, the way a shepherd understands a flock not through measurement but through years of attention. You'll be exposed, Picard said, when Odin outlined his role. In open space, with your abilities at reduced capacity, sustaining continuous use of the Odin force for 8 hours. I am aware of what it will cost, Odin said. I want to make sure you're making that choice with full information rather than... Captain? The single eye held something that was neither impatience nor reassurance but the particular quality of a very old man who has made choices of this magnitude before and carries the weight of each one. I have given an eye for wisdom. I have hung 9 days on a cosmic tree to master the runes. I have sent my ravens to the edges of all existence and felt their sight as my own. I know what it costs to hold something back from the dark. A pause, quiet and genuine. 8 hours is not my limit. It is my preference. Picard looked at him for a long moment. Then we proceed. They found the Herald 40 minutes later, 2 light-years from Dorvan, moving with the purposeful drift of something that navigates by appetite rather than navigation. On the view screen it was terrible in the specific way that things are terrible when their scale exceeds the brain's comfortable categories. 30 meters of primordial fire that had existed before the universe remembered being young, moving through the dark between stars with the patience of something that has no concept of hurry because it has no concept of time running out. The Enterprise dropped out of warp at a distance Data had calculated as optimal for deflector pulse initiation. Close enough for effect, far enough that hull temperature remained within manageable parameters. The Valdor decloaked on the Herald's opposite side 30 seconds later, positioning itself with the precision that Romulan pilots brought to maneuvers that had to be right the first time. Odin stood in the open shuttle bay door. He had declined an environmental suit, which Worf had presented as a suggestion, and then as a strong recommendation, and then as a formal security objection that he noted for the record. Odin had listened to all three with the patience he was increasingly extending to people whose concern he had decided to accept as genuine, and then he had declined. The Odin Force, he explained, was itself his environmental protection. In this universe, at reduced capacity, it would cost something to maintain. But an environmental suit would interfere with his ability to channel the Force outward, which would cost more. He gripped Gumnir. The spear hummed, that resonant, golden frequency that the ship's internal sensors had been recording since his arrival and had never successfully categorized. In the open shuttle bay, with the containment field the only barrier between him and vacuum, the hum became audible to the crew in adjacent corridors. Not loud. Not threatening. The sound of something very large and very old preparing to do what it was made for. "Enterprise, Valdor," Picard said into the open channel. "Execute on my mark." He watched the herald on the view screen. Watched it turn, and for a moment, impossibly, it seemed to look back. Not at the ships. At Odin. The way a fire looks at a hand reaching toward it. Mark. The deflector pulse hit first, a cycling frequency modulation that LaForge had been adjusting in real time for the last 40 minutes, and the herald's outer layer convulsed, a ripple of disruption moving through its plasma envelope like a shudder. It turned away from Dorvin, instinctively, reorienting toward the source of the irritant. The Valdor's containment field came up on its opposite side and the herald recoiled from the gravitational gradient with a violence that registered on sensors as a thermal spike of 6 million Kelvin. "Rage," Troy said from the bridge. "It feels like rage," which was not something she had expected to say about a fire. And then Odin moved. The Odin Force left him in a visible wave. Gold light in vacuum, impossibly beautiful. The kind of beautiful that belongs to things powerful enough that beauty and terror become the same response. It struck the herald not as a weapon but as a hand, a direction, a pressure applied with the knowledge of 10,000 years of managing things that could not be reasoned with but could be understood. The herald screamed. Not in sound, there was no medium for sound. But in every sensor on both ships simultaneously, a burst of energy across every frequency they could detect and several they couldn't. That data later described as consistent with a distress signal and Troy described, quietly, as pain. It moved. Away from Dorvin. Away from the rupture. Away from everything except the direction Odin was pressing it, and the walls the ships were building around it. "It's working," LaForge said, his voice carrying the compressed relief of someone who has learned not to celebrate early but cannot entirely help themselves. "Maintain positions," Picard said. 7 hours and 40 minutes remaining. On the sensor display, the rupture pulsed once, hungry, searching, and received nothing back. It was the longest 7 hours and 40 minutes of Picard's career, and it had only just begun. 4 hours and 17 minutes into the operation, the Borg arrived. There was no dramatic decloaking, no subspace communication, no tactical posturing. A Borg cube simply appeared, dropping out of transwarp approximately 800 kilometers off the Enterprise's starboard side with the characteristic indifference of a civilization that considered announcement an unnecessary expenditure of effort. It was immense in the way that Borg cubes are always immense. Not just in physical dimension but in implication, in the weight of what it represented, and the specific quality of dread it generated in every human nervous system that had ever heard the words resistance is futile and understood them to be a statement of fact rather than a threat. Worf's voice was flat with the particular tension of a Klingon managing the instinct to do something decisive in the absence of anything decisive to do. Borg cube. Configuration consistent with a mid-range tactical vessel. Weapons are not powered. Shields are nominal. They are not in attack posture. Yet, Picard said. Yet, Worf agreed. Data was already running the analysis. They have been here for some time, Captain. Passive observation. Their transwarp signature suggests they dropped out of active transit approximately 19 minutes ago, and have been holding position under minimal power. They were watching before they appeared. He looked up. They chose this moment to reveal themselves. Why now? LaForge asked over the comm. Because, Beta said, 19 minutes ago, the Odin Force emission from our shuttle bay reached a threshold that Borg sensors would classify as a distinctiveness profile of unprecedented value. He paused. Odin has been sustaining continuous output for 4 hours. The cumulative emission profile has grown significantly. The Borg have now assessed it as worth revealing themselves for. Picard closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. The specific second a captain allows himself when the situation has become measurably worse in a direction he had considered and hoped would not materialize. Then he opened them and was a captain again. Hail them. The Borg did not respond to hails. They never did. What came through the comm system instead was the sound that Picard had heard once before in circumstances he did not revisit voluntarily. The layered, harmonic drone of 1,000 voices speaking in such perfect unison that they became a single voice, vast and cold and entirely without malice, which was somehow worse than malice. We are the Borg. The entity designated Odin represents biological and cosmological distinctiveness that will improve the collective. His knowledge of dimensional architecture, his command of energy systems beyond current Borg understanding, and his physiological adaptation to transdimensional physics will be added to our own. Resistance is futile. In the shuttle bay, Odin did not turn from the Herald. He could not turn from the Herald. Breaking his direction of the Odin force for even 30 seconds would allow the Herald to reorient toward Dorvan, and 30 seconds was enough for a primordial fire to cross 2 light-years at the velocities it had demonstrated. But Picard, watching the internal sensor feed on his armrest display, saw the quality of Odin's stillness change. A new tension entering the ancient frame. Not fear. Picard was increasingly certain that fear was not a category Odin's nervous system meaningfully supported. But recognition. The specific attention of a mind encountering something it has no prior reference for and is rapidly building one. Picard opened the shuttle bay comm. Odin. The Borg have just announced their intention to assimilate you. I need you to know that, and I need you to know that I am going to do everything in my power to prevent it. But I also need you to maintain your position. A pause. The Odin force continued its steady golden pressure against the Herald, unwavering. A hive, Odin said. A collective consciousness that absorbs others. Yes. And what do your weapons do against them? Temporarily, Picard said carefully. They adapt. Another pause shorter. I have fought things that adapt. Gungnir's hum deepened by a register. Hold them as long as you can, Captain. I will not be taken by a machine that has forgotten what it means to be singular. The Borg cube moved at 0512 hours with the unhurried confidence of a civilization that had never needed to hurry. It came for the shuttle bay, specifically, precisely, with a navigational accuracy that data confirmed was targeted on Odin's exact position to within 3 meters. They had already mapped him. They were not approaching to assess. They were approaching to collect. Picard hit them with everything. The Enterprise's phaser banks opened across 6 emitter arrays simultaneously, a spread pattern that Worf had designed in the 3 minutes between the Borg's revelation and their advance. Not to damage, both of them knew better than that, but to force shield adaptation across multiple frequencies at once, consuming Borg processing capacity that might otherwise be directed toward assimilation beam targeting. The Valdor decloaked off the cube's aft section and added its disruptors. Torek had made the decision without being asked, without checking with the Romulan Senate or the Tal Shiar or anyone in his chain of command, which Picard noted and filed and thought that perhaps Odin had read him correctly in the observation lounge. The disruptors were no more effective than the phasers, but they were different, and different meant the Borg had to adapt to 2 separate weapons philosophies simultaneously rather than one. It bought them 4 minutes. The Borg adapted at 0516, their shields modulating to render both weapons systems functionally useless in the specific, humiliating way that Borg adaptation always worked, not by destroying the weapons but by making them irrelevant. The cube continued its advance. Assimilation tubule arrays deployed from its forward face, each one capable of initiating nanoprobe injection from a distance that was decreasing by the second. And then Odin made a choice. He turned. Not fully. Not completely, not enough to release the herald, which Picard could see on the sensor display immediately beginning to drift back toward Dorvan the moment the Odin force pressure diminished by a fraction. But enough. Enough to extend his left hand, Gungnir still in his right, and bring the Odin force to bear on the Borg cube in a way that was not hurting and was not direction, but was the oldest expression of power in the 9 realms. The cube stopped. Not from damage. Not from a shield or a weapon. It stopped the way a river stops when it encounters bedrock, finding something that did not yield, that was not a variable in the equation it had been running, that existed outside the Borg Collective's vast catalog of resistance and adaptation and futility because it was not resistance, and it was not technology, and it had no frequency to adapt to. It was will. Raw, ancient, cosmologically grounded will. The same force that had hung 9 days on Yggdrasil, that had faced the Midgard serpent, that had carried the weight of 10,000 years of impossible decisions and had not broken under any of them. Odin spoke, and this time his voice did not travel through comm systems. It traveled through the Odin force itself, and every speaker on every ship in range carried it simultaneously. I am Odin. I have seen the end of all things and I have chosen to stand between it and what I love. You will not have me. You will not have this world. You are a very impressive achievement, he said, and the word achievement carried the weight of someone who has met gods and giants and cosmic abstractions and is grading on a generous curve. For a civilization that has forgotten why achieving things matters. The tubule arrays retracted. Not fully. Not permanently. The Borg were not retreating, they were recalculating. But the recalculation was costing them something, because Odin's will had introduced a variable they genuinely had not encountered before, and their processing was cycling on it the way a computer cycles on a problem that does not resolve. But the turning had cost Odin too. On the internal sensor feed, Picard watched the Odin force emission drop by 12% in the 4 seconds Odin had diverted it. And in those 4 seconds, the herald had covered a quarter of the distance to Dorvan. 3 hours and 6 minutes remained. Odin turned back. The golden pressure reasserted. The herald slowed, stopped, screamed its silent scream across every sensor frequency. But on Picard's display, the Odin force emission indicator did not return to its previous level. It held at 88% of what it had been. And it was still dropping. Picard saw it before anyone said it aloud. The Odin force emission on his armrest display was a line that had been steady for 4 hours and was now a gradual, undeniable slope. Not a cliff, not a sudden catastrophic failure, but the specific, patient decline of something being spent faster than it could recover. The difference between a fire burning and a fire burning out. Small enough that it could be misread as sensor variance. Large enough that Picard, who had spent 30 years learning to read the difference between a ship under strain and a ship under fatal strain, understood exactly what he was looking at. He did the calculation in his head, checked it against Data's console over the android's shoulder without explanation, and Data, who had already done the same calculation and reached the same conclusion, met his eyes with the particular quality of silence that meant the numbers were not good, and there was no version of the numbers that was good. At current depletion rate, accounting for the additional drain of the Borg containment effort and the Herald's increasing resistance as it grew more desperate, Odin's ability to sustain the Odin force at operationally sufficient levels would expire in approximately 90 minutes. 2 hours and 43 minutes remained on the 8-hour window. Picard went to the shuttle bay. He suited up, because unlike Odin he was a creature of biological vulnerability and respected that fact. And he walked to the edge of the containment field where Odin stood in vacuum, and the gulf between them was a shimmer of atmospheric pressure, and the entire philosophical distance between mortality and something that had never meaningfully considered it. Odin did not turn. The Odin force continued its steady, diminished pulse, golden, vast, and visibly costing him now. There was a quality to the ancient frame that Picard had not seen before, a weight in the set of his shoulders that had nothing to do with physical fatigue and everything to do with the particular exhaustion of a mind that has been doing something enormous for a very long time. "You know," Picard said. "I have known for some time," Odin said. His voice, even now, carried its full resonance, the only thing about him that wasn't visibly diminishing. "An hour, perhaps. Perhaps less. Then we need another approach." "There is another approach." Odin was quiet for a moment. The herald burned against the dark, held at distance, pressing against the Odin force pressure with the mindless persistence of something that has no option but to push. "I have been considering it since the Borg arrived. I did not raise it because I was hoping the mathematics would change. They haven't. No." A pause. "They have not." He turned then, fully, for the first time since the operation began, and the herald immediately began its drift toward Dorvan, but Odin looked at Picard and the look contained everything that the last several hours had built between them, and Picard held it without looking away. "The rupture," Odin said. "If I drive the herald into it, not hurt it, not pressure it, but strike it with the full remaining capacity of the Odin force in a single directed blow, the herald will be forced back through the barrier. The energy of that impact, channeled correctly, will cause the rupture to collapse inward from this side. A door closing from both ends simultaneously." Picard processed this. "And you?" "I would need to be at the rupture to direct the collapse. Inside its event horizon, to ensure the dimensional seal is complete." The single eye held something that was not resignation and was not peace and was perhaps the thing that exists between them. The expression of someone who has made a decision they understand completely, and have made anyway. "There is a reasonable possibility that I would be caught in the collapse." "Define reasonable." "In the 9 realms, I would say it is the kind of gamble I would take on a good day." A pause, almost, wry. "In this universe, with 8 parts in 10 of my power and falling, it is the kind of gamble I am required to take regardless." "There has to be another way," Picard said, and he heard in his own voice something that surprised him, not the captain's tactical assessment, but something more direct, more human, the voice of someone who does not want to lose the person they are talking to. Odin heard it too. Something shifted in his face. "You are a remarkable man, Jean-Luc Picard," he said, with the quietness of genuine sentiment from someone for whom genuine sentiment had become, over 10,000 years, a rare and carefully rationed thing. "You lead not through authority but through the quality of your attention. You make people." His eye moved briefly to the Valdor on the sensor display, to the memory of 12 technicians on a burning moon. "Want to be worth your regard." He looked back. "I have known kings for 10 millennia. Very few of them understood what you appear to have known for some time." "What's that?" "That the measure of a civilization is not what it can destroy," Odin said, "but what it chooses to protect. And what it is willing to pay for that protection." He turned back to the herald. "Get your ship clear of the rupture's event horizon," he said. 2 light minutes should be sufficient. Take the Romulans with you." His hand tightened on Gungnir, and the spear's hum rose to a register that Picard could feel through his suit, through his bones, through something deeper than his bones. "And tell your android to watch the sensor readings carefully. What he sees in the next few minutes, the dimensional mechanics of a voluntary barrier collapse initiated by an Odin force discharge, may be the most scientifically significant event your civilization has ever recorded." "I'll tell him," Picard said. He stood there for one more moment. "Odin." The Allfather looked at him. "The Federation does not forget debts. Whatever happens on the other side of that barrier. If there's a way back, if there's a signal, any kind of resonance that could indicate your survival, we will be looking for it. I want you to know that." The ancient face was still. Then, slowly, the weight in it shifted, not lifting precisely, but redistributing, the way weight redistributes when someone finds something to lean it against. "Then perhaps," Odin said, I will give you something to look for. He raised Gungnir. Picard ran. Not from fear. From the specific urgency of a captain who has been given a task by someone he respects and intends to complete it before the window closes. He was on the bridge in 90 seconds, suited down in 40 more, in the command chair issuing the evacuation order as he sat. All hands, maximum warp. Heading 27 Mark 315. Mr. Worf, signal the Valdor, same heading, maximum speed, move now. Captain, Worf began. Now, Mr. Worf. The Enterprise jumped to warp. On the aft sensor feed, which Data was recording at maximum resolution, every instrument at full sensitivity, because Picard had told him what was coming, Odin was already moving. The Odin force left him not as the steady golden pressure of the last 8 hours but as everything, all of it, the full remaining reservoir of the Allfather's power discharged in a single directed strike that crossed the distance between Odin and the Herald in less time than the sensors could individually timestamp. It hit the Herald with a force that registered on instruments 2 light-years away as a thermal event of cosmic magnitude, and the Herald, struck by something it could not adapt to, could not consume, could not learn from, did the only thing left to it. It went home. Through the rupture. Fast, faster than it had ever moved, driven by the force of a god's last full measure of power, trailing plasma fire that guttered and died the moment it crossed the dimensional barrier. The rupture flared gold and violet and a white that existed below the visible spectrum and above it simultaneously, and then Odin went in after it. Not chasing. Directing. One hand on the dimensional mechanics of a universe that was not his own, the other holding Gungnir, threading the Odin force through the rupture's event horizon with the precision of someone who had mastered runes by hanging on the boundary between existence and void and understood, in his bones, what barriers between realities felt like from the inside. The rupture collapsed. On Data's console, the event took 4.7 seconds. In Picard's memory, it would always take longer. The fold of dimensional space, the implosion of the boundary between 2 universes, the silence on the sensor feed where the Odin force signature had been and was no longer. Then nothing. The rupture was gone. The Herald was gone. The dimensional interference that had been saturating every comm frequency in the sector cleared instantly, like a sound cutting off, leaving a silence that felt enormous. The Enterprise dropped out of warp. On the view screen, Sector 441 was unremarkable again. Sparse stars. Empty space. A navigational hazard zone near the Cardassian border. Picard sat in his command chair and looked at it for a long time. Data, he said finally. The sensor readings. Recorded in full, Captain. Every instrument, maximum resolution, complete event capture. Data looked up from his console. It is, as he predicted, the most scientifically significant event our instruments have ever recorded. A pause. There is also something else. Picard looked at him. In the final 0.3 seconds before the rupture closed, Data said carefully, there is an anomalous energy signature. Distinct from the collapse event. Consistent with a deliberate, focused emission of the Odin force directed outward, toward this universe, rather than inward toward the dimensional barrier. He turned his console to face Picard. It is, Captain, a pattern. Structured. Recursive. It repeats at a frequency that our universal translation matrix identifies as. He stopped, which was remarkable. Data, Picard said. Has a name, Captain. Data said. It repeats your name. The bridge of the Enterprise held its breath. Picard looked at the pattern on Data's console. The recursive, structured pulse of the Odin force encoded in the final moments of a collapsing dimensional barrier, deliberate as a signature, precise as a promise, and felt something that his Starfleet training had no formal category for. Not hope, exactly. Not certainty. The thing between them. The thing that makes a man keep looking at the stars after the light he was watching has already moved on. He thought about a king who had given an eye for wisdom. who had hung 9 days on the boundary between existence and void because the knowledge on the other side was worth the cost, who had walked through fire for 12 strangers because a man in a small shuttle had used the word mine and meant it. He thought about what Troy had said at the beginning. Grief. Loss. 10,000 years of decisions. He thought about what Odin had said at the end. Perhaps I will give you something to look for. The Federation would study the sensor data from Sector 441 for years. Data's recordings of the dimensional collapse would reshape theoretical physics in ways that took a decade to fully map. New frameworks for subspace topology, new models of dimensional barrier mechanics, new questions about the nature of the Odin force that generated entire academic disciplines and answered almost none of their own questions, which is what good science does. The rupture did not reopen. The Herald did not return. In the Dwarven sector, 62,000 people went about their lives in complete ignorance of how close the dark had come, which was exactly how Picard preferred it. The Borg cube withdrew without further communication, which was either reassuring or deeply concerning depending on your disposition, and Picard chose to file it under problems for another day with the practiced equanimity of a man who has learned that the queue of existential threats is never actually empty. Toruk returned to the Valdor and, before departing, sent a personal transmission to Picard that contained no tactical intelligence, no political positioning, and no trace of Tal Shiar calculation, only a Romulan commander's quiet acknowledgement that he had witnessed something that had changed the dimensions of his understanding, and that he considered the debt between them mutual. It was, Picard reflected, the most honest thing a Romulan had ever said to him. The Enterprise resumed her survey of Sector 441. And every morning, in the hours before the Alpha shift, Picard sat in his ready room with his Earl Grey and looked at the pattern data had preserved, his name, encoded in the Odin force, sent across the boundary between universes by a king who had learned, perhaps for the first time in 10,000 years, that some debts are worth owing. He kept looking. Some doors, once opened, leave light on both sides. Live long and prosper. Hit the subscribe button for more interesting stories. Thank you for watching.